All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Security Compass webinar. Today's webinar will be on security value streams. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Raquel Rodriguez, the events manager here at Security Compass, and your host for today's webinar. Before we get started with the actual content, I'd like to give you a quick overview of Security Compass. For those of you who may not be aware of us until today, Security Compass was founded in 2004 and began with a team of experienced penetration testers. Today, we have come far and work with many large enterprises globally to manage their cybersecurity risk through balanced development automation. We have three key offerings. Our flagship product, SD Elements, enables organizations to deliver software quickly and reduce costs through automation. Our modular role-based e-learning solutions empower organizations to embrace DevSecOps. And our strategic advisory services offer expertise in cloud security, pen testing, and red teaming for a better security posture. Let's quickly go through some housekeeping items. As you might notice, you have all entered the session on mute to reduce background noise. Second, a recording of this webinar will be available after today's event, and you will receive an email with a link to the recording. We will also be publishing this recording in the resources section of our website. Also, we encourage everyone to raise questions. Please submit your questions into the Q&A chat and we will address them during the Q&A session. If after our session you would like to follow up with us or you have a future topic you would like to see covered, please email us at contact@securitycompass.com. Like I mentioned, for today's webinar, we're going to take a close look at security value streams. I'm pleased to have here with me Altaz, Director of Insights Research at Security Compass, and Spencer, Security Wizard at Reddit. Altaz and Spencer, thank you for being here with me today. I know our audience is keen to hear your presentation, so I'll let you take it from here.
That's great. Thank you very much, Raquel. Appreciate that. And I think it might make sense maybe to talk a little bit about our backgrounds and what we do. Spencer, you want to go first and talk a little bit about what you do at Reddit?
Yeah, sure. So I'm an application security engineer at Reddit. Of course, nobody's heard of Reddit, a small little social media company. Prior to that, I was a deputy CISO for a North America energy company and kind of grew up in the management consulting space with security, and then kind of figured out that, oh, offensive security is kind of cool. But I'm one of the lucky few who has a kind of a business background and understands how to speak securityese with people who might not understand security. And so very interested to share my opinion about value streams today.
Wonderful. Glad to have you here. And as Raquel mentioned, I'm Altaz. I'm with Security Compass. My role is from a research perspective to collaborate with folks in the industry and academia. And so if you're at all interested in collaborating with us, don't hesitate, reach out. More than happy to conduct some joint research initiatives with you. Having said that, let's just dive straight into the topic for today. This is going to be very conversational, so if you've got any questions, don't hesitate, just put them in the chat window. We'll be more than happy to kind of take these as they come along. And I think it makes sense when we get started here to first of all talk about value streams. It's a big buzzword in the industry right now. Everybody seems to be focused on value streams. We want to produce value. The question is, who are we producing value for? Are we producing value for an end customer? Are we producing value for someone on the technical side? And what we generally do is we try and take a look and find out what's of importance to that end customer, whoever that happens to be, internal or external, and then work our way backwards to see what are the various activities that we can engage in that will help us at each step derive value towards that final product that we're going to deliver to that end customer or that end user. So along those lines, many times when we talk about value streams, the focus tends to be more at the project level. So we hear a lot about DevOps and Agile, and it's about value streams in producing an artifact that we can get out to market quickly, that meets the needs functionally and non-functionally of that end customer, for example. But the bigger challenge that we're finding in Security Compass, and as we collaborate with others in the industry, is there's a gap here in identifying what's the value of security specifically to the business. And that's a very, very different conversation, because it's no longer about things like, how quickly can we just get through the pipeline? that's certainly a part of it, but there's more to it, which is the balancing of the risk now. And how do we engage this in a way that creates that balance so that the business has the assurance to help us kind of move forward with this. So I'm just going to pause for a moment. And Spencer, I'd like to get your thoughts on value streams and whether you're seeing things similar to what I just described. Are businesses looking to try to define, what value are security teams offering?
Yeah, I really think there's two fronts when I think about talking about value streams. One, traditionally, security teams may not have been part of that value stream conversation. So I know from my experience, there might be giant IT machinations that are focusing on metrics and service management and most of the ITSM things that we kind of take for granted in most organizations.
Mhm.
Security oftentimes isn't part of that conversation. And so it's really hard to measure, sometimes can be really hard to measure security related concepts. And so we're kind of on a disparity between the other parts of the IT organization and security. So how do we talk about value when we don't do a lot of those things that bring value? And there's a lot of reasons why we may not do that. I think the other part is understanding the security team's role within this value stream for other folks. So there is definitely a lot of materials out there around like, here are the things that you should be doing for a security team, but unless there is good reason why you are doing those components within the value stream, then maybe you don't need to do them at all. Maybe you should be focusing on other components. So I think it's really interesting when you put kind of that business spin on just, well, I'm going to provide host-based intrusion detection across the enterprise. Like that's great. That's a thing that we as security people love to talk about because we checked a box off the control. But what does it actually mean to provide value back to the IT organization and that other folks who maybe don't know what HIDS even means, how to explain to them, yeah, we're actually adding value back into the enterprise.
Yeah. And I think so now the question that comes out is, okay, so we understand we need to have security offer some business value. How do we go about achieving this? Are there any techniques, any hints, any guidance that we can use? So what we're going to do in this particular webcast is we're just going to take a look at one framework. It's an open framework put out by the Open Group called IT for IT. Let me just quickly share my screen here and let's take a look and see how we might be able to go and see how we can offer value to the business. So bear with me here. I'm just going to flip over to my other screen. All right, can you see my screen there, Spencer?
Yep, sure can.
Okay, great. So here's what the framework looks like. Again, this is an open framework by the Open Group. You're welcome to go in there, you log in, you basically download this. And the way they looked at it is rather than looking at it just from a security perspective, they took a slightly higher perspective on this, higher level, and looked at it from an IT standpoint. And so what you'll notice is when we look at the value streams here that IT should be providing ultimately back to the business, we've got 4 of these things. So it really comes down to somehow helping from a planning perspective, helping from a build perspective, looking at it from a delivery standpoint, and finally looking at how do we execute this from a run standpoint. So plan, build, deliver, run. To folks that come in from a lean background, you're probably recognizing some of this terminology. But if we look at it at a high level, the value streams that IT offers are around strategy to portfolio. So we've got a strategy, we need to enable that strategy. Out of that discussion falls out some kind of a portfolio. And then we get into taking each element of that portfolio and looking at the requirements to deployment. So we have, in many cases, in software development, we will have certain requirements for the software, and we want to get to a deployment. There's also an element of request to fulfill, which is about how do we go in and provide a service back to the business in terms of them being able to get the information and the data that they're looking for, and also in terms of supporting. And then finally, detect to correct. What happens if something goes wrong? How do we quickly get this from an ops standpoint back into the pipeline so that we can now very quickly address and fix and mitigate the concerns that are center at this point. In all of this, we're looking at agility. which is a big thing for businesses today. We want to be able to go and be able to enable the business while at the same time from a security lens, giving them the ability to manage the risk. And at the bottom, we've got a whole bunch of supporting activities. We're not going to really talk about these supporting activities today, but I'd like us to focus on the top 4 areas here. Now, assuming that IT is mapping to the business and trying to manage these 4 value streams, can we take a look from a security perspective and see how security might also align from an IT perspective on how these value streams can be achieved? In other words, we're enabling now other teams to achieve what they offer back to the business. So let's start by talking about strategy to portfolio at this point. So generally, there's a strategy that's been developed by the business. It's now up to the teams to go in and to enable that for the business. So Spencer, can we talk a little bit from a security perspective? You know, we've got a lot of techniques that we use. Are there things that security teams can do to help a business from a strategy to portfolio perspective?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things that I would probably mention. Folks are probably pretty familiar with security requirements within that strategy portfolio. Like there should be an overview of here are the different types of security requirements that fit into the objectives that we should be achieving. So a couple of examples that might be, we need to have alerting and monitoring. We need to understand how we're doing authentication. We need there's a million things. Like this is normally the death by spreadsheet or checklist that most security folks are familiar with. I think what's interesting here is to have a security awareness of what is in that strategy and portfolio. I think a lot of times security folks are focused on, I need to meet these requirements, whether they be regulatory or they be industry standards, et cetera, but not really understanding, well, what is the actual importance of, in a business context, how do the security things that we're going to be delivering actually match up with those strategies and objectives? So just being cognizant is really the first step that a lot of security folks can take to understand how does the business actually operate, and then how can you kind of wrap security around that. It's really challenging because one, it requires you to talk to business folks, which is normally sometimes very scary. But then it also kind of, you have to have an open mind of, well, not every risk is bad, not every risk can be addressed. Sometimes it's okay to take those risks, but understanding what is the strategy, what are the fundamental components that actually make up your business, that can help influence how you might or might not make security decisions down the line.
Yeah, many times I've heard in the discussions that I've had anyway, we are speaking in a language that is too far below what the business is looking for, right? To them, it's very clear cut. We're looking to generate revenue. We're looking for brand recognition. We're looking to speed the market. Like all these kinds of things become really important. And so when we start to approach how we align security, it needs to map ultimately to those business needs that come in. And looking at the next stage here, which is the requirements to deploy. And this is generally where the SDLC comes in. And I think there are security activities that we can put in here. But talk a little bit about how this could add value ultimately back to the business. Spencer, thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think most folks are probably familiar with an SDLC component of, you have your requirements up front, you have testing in the middle, and some post-production things that happen at the end. That kind of normal stream from an SDLC perspective. That's really this area. I think and I think we do a pretty good job of that, right? Like there are great resources like the OWASP ASVS or CIS controls. Like there's a lot of good material on here are the requirements that we give to other people as security practitioners. I think what's a little bit more interesting is to understand how do we kind of flip that lens on ourselves and say, what are our security team's requirements? How are we going to trace through, like if we're going to deploy out a new technology, do we actually follow the same process that other teams actually do, right? Like I know some of us may not have the luxury of having like technical PMs or the ability to actually do that entire journey, but I think a lot of that value that the IT organization itself is doing it from a development or an infrastructure perspective, focusing that on ourselves as security folks can add value because we know exactly what our requirements are. We're not just saying, well, I think we should do antivirus everywhere. but like, okay, why? What's our metric that we're going to be evaluating against? How, like, what's the things that we do care about versus don't care about? Like, that's where you might pull in a MITRE framework, for example. Like, what are these requirements? I think a lot of times security teams kind of just gloss over that and say, well, this is the objective. And as long as we can do that, regardless of some of the other requirement stuff, that is what we are going to shoot for. So I think that's really interesting for us to talk about, taking that requirement and that deploy strategy that developers are doing every day, day in, day out, looking at how we do security deployments and like either tools evaluations or new functionality implementations of security projects, et cetera, using that on ourselves is very interesting, and then helps translate that into other business value that other folks, IT directors, et cetera, can pick up and run with, because now they understand, well, this is what they set out to do, and this is what they actually achieved.
Yeah, and I think also as we think about each of the activities that we do and the requirements to deploy value stream here, it's important to tie this back to things like business risk. So we may conduct a threat model on a given subsystem, for example, and we may consider all the different nuances and the different attack vectors, for that particular subsystem. And the situation that comes up is the mitigation that we then suggest to someone on the business side. I mean, they're looking at this thing and saying, how important is this? Do I really need to go to the nth degree to fix all of this? Are there some of these things that I could maybe do without? Can I put other compensating controls in place, as an example? And it's thinking along those lines and trying to balance the equation. Again, we've got several things that the business wants to do. They can't do everything. Are we enabling them to do those things that are most important for them? And if it turns out that, for example, speed to market is important, then we would think about a threat model that might enable that. Yes, there are other things we need to think about, but as of right now, what's important to the business are the following things. And so our approach to this and our recommendation on what needs to be done from a security standpoint has to map ultimately back to that kind of value that's offered to the business. And it's interesting, once we start to talk that way and folks on the business side begin to understand that we are trying to enable them, then the discussion opens up. And now that you've got the ear of folks on the business side, there's a greater opportunity to go in there and say, hey, there's something else you might want to think about that maybe you haven't thought about yet. But it becomes an insight that someone on the business side can then start to even take a look in the future to see if there are other things that we should be taking a look at. And this has implications on things like procurement, how do we staff things up, training, a whole bunch of stuff. But there's a role that security can play in there if we adapt the way that we position our final reports and mitigations and align those with what the business is looking for. Spencer, any other comments? Any other thoughts?
No, I think that's pretty good. Like this historically is probably where most of security folks shine. Like we are pretty good at giving those requirements. I think one of the other things I'll mention too is the way in which we give those requirements is very interesting, right? Like there is normal IT value chain propositions for how requirements are fed from a technical or a product spec into a design document into whatever. Like that development process normally is pretty fluid. Making sure that we as security folks can hook into that existing process to help drive those requirements, that's something that's really key. Like reducing that friction within that cycle of requirement to deploy, making sure that it's frictionless. I think that's probably the biggest takeaway, because folks will adopt whatever if you want to push requirements or if you want to push certain testing or push certain things that are within the SDLC, then if it's frictionless, people will adopt it. If it's something they're already familiar with, it's great. That's probably one of the other big things is just see whatever IT existing process is in place and hooking into that rather than kind of wedging our own security process into that stream. That's really important.
Yeah. And I think I would also extend that, looking at IT processes and also business processes. So for example, organizations will typically have some kind of a risk assessment or risk management process. How do we align with what's there. We don't want to throw everything out. Some stuff that's there is in fact quite useful, and we need that. We need to know who's involved, what are the processes they've been using. Maybe there are tools that they're already using. Can we leverage what we are doing to add value in those particular scenarios? So it really is looking at this thing more holistically and trying to see how we might be able to offer this value to multiple teams. And what's interesting is we might have, say we conducted a threat model and we end up with a recommendation on how to mitigate a particular attack scenario. We can take that particular insight and offer it in a way that's digestible to risk teams, to IT teams, to the development teams, to all these other teams. So it's the same insight, but how we couch it and how we position it and how we communicate that becomes just as important as well. And that's all part of the value stream. You're thinking not in terms of what your day-to-day activity is, but you're thinking about what is important and of value to each of the constituents that are going to make use of this information that you now have, and positioning it in that sense. Let's move forward now to request to fulfill. And generally in request to fulfill, it's around a support structure. We want the business to ideally have a self-service model where they can come in and get what they want without security teams getting in the way, right? They want to know security posture. They want to know, are we compliant? They want to know these kinds of business questions. How resilient are we? Can you give me the assurance? And if we have to keep going back to a team and that team is super busy and we don't have enough people on that team, then generally the request to fulfill value tends to diminish in the eyes of the business. Spencer, can you talk a little bit about this request to fulfill area of the value streams?
Yeah, I think I'll harken back to the original discussion around strategy portfolio, turning that lens on the security team itself. I've been in numerous organizations where there isn't a great self-service portal from a security standpoint, right? Like we're lurkers in the background. We might hook into existing, like help desk processes, et cetera. But actually being, presenting a customer-facing portal, like hooking in, if you're on ServiceNow or Remedy, like some sort of ITSM platform, hooking into that and providing security services through that portal, even if it's code reviews, if it's I think I've got some weird stuff on my laptop. Like if there's a presentation on the portal that makes that more accessible and people understand what exactly is in that catalog. There's a lot of things that go into the request to fulfill process that would be a benefit to have described and make common knowledge aware of what this service is throughout the enterprise. And I've been in numerous shops that don't ever focus on that. And just like you can request a new laptop, you should be able to request security services for whatever is offered. And then you get all the other additional benefits that we'll talk about in the next phase for the detect to correct. So taking that lens and focusing on, well, how can we do the same type of shopping carts or ticket management processes within security? That's going to be very interesting to show business value, because then you can track the requests that are coming in. You can track how long did it take to do these things. That's turning into, like, I've got this volume every month. Well, that means that it turns out to be this amount of headcount. Like, I'm understaffed to be able to do all of the requests that are coming in from a security standpoint. So you gain all of these metrics that maybe previously you were just like, well, I've got one SOC engineer who's just trying to knock stuff out day in, day out, and burning out because you don't have that request to fulfill process in some sort of tool that lets you help measure what actually is going on in that process.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned, the SOC, and I think there's some tie-in here. I agree to the detect to correct element. So when we look at request to fulfill, many times we'll talk about like OSINT, tools that can allow us to go in and extract information, and we might have it put into a SIEM, for example. But I mean, the information is there, but now what? Can we somehow translate this into something that the business understands, the language that they speak around revenue and risk and resiliency and compliance, things like that? So, if we're noticing, as an example, that there's a trend, how is this information getting back to the business in a way that is scalable? right? Doesn't require them to continually go and try and ask for translations as we're producing reports for them. There are also things here, I think, that relate to all the way from the portfolio level. We've initiated certain programs. We've now, started to, in the requirements to deploy value streams, started to take a look and see how we can operationalize these things. But, looking at it as this is even rolling out, are there things that the business person looking at this might want to understand? We may not have deployed the entire solution yet, but there's still some data that's coming through. There's some information in there. Not only that, but are there things that can help educate people on the business side? And I think there's uh, a possibility here of considering things like knowledge bases, looking at providing some very simple high-level training that can be used to fulfill a particular gap that exists on the business side. These are all parts of a support team, and how this a security support team might be able to go in now and to enable what the business is looking for. And I think all of this ties again to what we were looking at from a strat to portfolio level. How can we enable the business so that we're balancing both this need for risk and speed at the same time? So let's carry on and take a look at this idea now, which is really the realm of like SecOps, for example, which is detect to correct. Spencer, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think as security folks, we do a pretty good job within our security sphere around this, right? Like most of us have a SIM probably. We're doing correlation rules. We have a boatload of alerts that are coming out. I think like that within our own security ecosystem is a pretty well quantified thing in 2020. I think what is more interesting is how that then spurs into other business processes. So if I continually to see, like a lot of network sockets on a particular service, like does that information actually make it back to an infra ops team? There's a lot of benefit with a lot of these security tools that we have, where we know what's going on boxes, we can see what's happening within web apps, but that value may not be readily apparent or exposed to our infrastructure application security team. So I think, just kind of putting that business lens on of, well, okay, is this data valuable to someone else outside of security, and sharing that, I bet you would make a bunch of friends, and you might even fix problems that aren't necessarily related to security. That helps, show, okay, we've got these monitoring tools. They can actually help us solve business needs, and then that equates to, better stuff down the road for everybody. So I think that's an interesting lens, that if you're focused specifically on, like, I got to find all the bad guys, I got to close all the tickets, that's not something that you maybe would think about, but it's definitely like, it's going to show you value where, we are providing that data to other folks and helping to feed and supplement some of the other direct processes that might exist across other IT processes.
Yeah, and so now when we look at requirements to deploy, which is a lot of development happens here, a lot of building, and then we look at detect to correct, which is now we're in an operational mode. So if we look at DevOps, it's essentially taking this value stream and this value stream and trying to kind of combine the two of them and seeing what we can now do to offer increased value ultimately back to the business, typically in the form of quicker delivery, greater alignment to the original intent of the requirements, those kinds of things. And I just, I'd like to ask you a question, Spencer, to get your thoughts. There's a people element to this as well. So while we consider all of these value streams and how we're trying to offer value back to the business, for every one of these, there may in fact be different people that may get involved, but it's being facilitated by the security team. Can you talk a little bit about, how across this these sets of value streams here, how a security team might enable the collaboration that is required, not just with technical teams, but also from a business, from a risk, from a compliance, from an audit standpoint, to kind of bring all of this stuff together? Is that something that you feel that a security team can enable?
I definitely think so. It's just a matter of scale is what it often comes down to. right? So some security teams are extremely lean, and it might be just a SOC team, somebody that's doing the day-to-day security operations, looking at dashboards, et cetera. You might be lucky to have an actual IT risk management team. You might be lucky enough to have an application security team. I think the touch points are quite numerous throughout this entire process. And so getting that interface with PMs or developers, or actually making it back to the business requirements, and talking to business folks, a lot of it has to do with scale. I think, minimum, a CISO is someone whose primary job should be integrating with that business side. And so that should be their primary focus when talking about how do we get better involved within this IT value chain, on top of all the other things a CISO should be doing. But that's really where it would start. And then understanding like the skill sets that you might have on the team, the communication strengths and weaknesses that might be on the team. A lot of those will also play, just because processes are run by people, will also play a big part in this. I think what really helps us scale, though, is being able to integrate with that ITSM tool to input ourselves or get call outs to security, so we know when to get engaged. And it becomes less of a, well, who do you know? Do they like you? Will they reach out to you? To a, it's mandated by a workflow within a technology tool that helps us make sure that every single time it's a repeatable process, it's a repeatable step, it's going to go to the same place. I think that's probably the only way that I've seen to be able to scale that out. Again, kind of goes back to hooking into existing IT processes, getting security kind of shoved into that ITSM workflow. That's really important, because otherwise you're going to be chasing your tail a lot, because there's so many touch points within this value stream.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because it now touches on this whole idea of lean, right? You talked about integrating with the other processes, and you talked about, how we can go in there and how we can interface with different people. I think, the other thing that we need to consider as well is in every one of these value streams, and again, this is just one framework. I hope folks, don't think that this is the only framework out there. This is just an example of how you might be able to provide value and codify that back to the business. So when we look at all of these value streams that we've got here, ultimately what we want to do is strive for efficiency. If, for example, we are in the requirements to deploy area and we're trying to help, for example, dev teams, and we come in heavy-handed, it's really going to slow those teams down. So we have to be really lean and think about how can we do this in a way that is most efficient. But it's not just in the build value stream, but it also happens in the planning, right? If we've been asked to go in there and construct a portfolio of security activities that we think are going to be important to help reduce risk for the business, and at the same time enable them to move forward and capture new markets, for example, right? How are we going to do that efficiently? Do we have something in place that will enable us to extract this information, defensively go back to the business and say, here you go, this is what we think you should be focusing on? And similarly, when it comes to the other value streams as well. So, this idea that we want to go in and do this thing as efficiently as possible, oftentimes, when we look at lean, the idea of trying to minimize waste is closely tied to the idea of how quickly we can get through something. When I say quickly, I should rephrase that. It's not about looking at the speed to go through it, but it's the time that is taken to invest in that activity. Are we doing that particular activity as efficiently as possible? Are we involving, the right people? Like if we've got a meeting, for example, do we need to include everybody in those meetings? Or is that just wasted time that perhaps we could be using somebody else in a different area? These are the kinds of questions that now emerge, and it just reframes the thinking around, are we continually offering value back to the business folks, and looking at how we are intersecting with these other teams and not interfering with what they're doing. So Spencer, in terms of looking at it from a lean perspective, from your experience, have you found that traditionally, when security teams have to get involved and intersect with other teams, that it tends to be a lot of people in the meetings that maybe shouldn't be there? Or do you find that just because of the nature of how we've got so few security folks, that we are almost backing into looking at how we do security in a lean way?
Yeah, I think we're definitely forced into that because there's never enough security folks or never enough budget for security stuff. So I think that's definitely something that should be top of mind whenever folks are interacting with other business processes. But I think another fallacy that we maybe fall into is trying to do everything the best in the initial go.
Yeah.
So the development world has this MVP concept, the minimum viable product, right? Security teams should also have that similar type of concept where I don't necessarily need a 300 line item spreadsheet for all of my application security requirements. Maybe I focus on what, driven by hopefully some other data that might exist, like past breaches or, if you don't have anything and you say, well, let's focus on OWASP top 10, like something to help prune down that massive list of this is what perfection would look like if everything was secured to bank grade, military grade, whatever grade that is kosher nowadays. To get to that level, maybe just start with something much smaller, right? And then keep iterating on that. Like the CMMI maturity model is a great way to kind of think about how does that ramp up. Start with something small, especially if you've never injected yourself into that process. Starting small and then continuing to grow is probably it's not gonna make you any enemies for sure, and it will help start getting folks conscious about, well, here's these high level things, and now you can start refining and getting better data. I think the challenge that I've had is, you've got like the OWASP ASVS, which is a long list of requirements that you should be doing from an AppSec perspective. But if you drop that on developers day one, especially without any training, without any socialization, it's not going to go over very well. But if you say, well, let's think about these 5 concepts: authentication, authorization, logging, how we're going to do validation, like general concepts, developers will be like, yeah, okay, that kind of makes sense. And you might miss something here and there, but you at least start that conversation and you can start improving on injecting yourself into that requirements process. Becomes a lot better of a discussion. So I think looking at each one of these areas, you basically have to iterate that same type of concept where start small, figure out what you can do. If it's a small set of requirements, or we're going to start measuring certain small things within our security operations environment to help provide you that data so that then you can go and continue to make better. I think that's very important. And sometimes we don't have the luxury of the time to be able to do that. So that's kind of the catch-22. That will help make us better, but it also requires time and thought in order for us to become better. So getting that carved out and figuring out how to work that into our daily schedule, that's an interesting conversation. It's definitely different for everyone, but if you can't do it, then you'll stay at the same level of agility and efficiency that you're currently at. You won't be able to improve.
Yeah. So we've gone through these value streams here, and I guess it begs the question now from a governance standpoint, who owns this, right? Is it the CISO? Is it a security architect? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think in most large orgs, there's an enterprise architecture group that would own the process that looks like this. I think the integration within this existing process, if it does exist, is definitely the responsibility of the CISO, right? They are kind of that business interface. They should be helping to drive the adoption into here. And certainly he or she could be delegating out, et cetera, but their responsibility should be for making sure that these things are actually being done. We're starting to get integrated. We're following these processes that exist on the IT side, because again, this goes back to now he has more data. You can take the metrics and things that are coming out of the request to fulfill, the detect to correct phase, take that back to the business, and that's justification for headcount, for budget, for all these other things that we know are required in order for a security team to actually function. So, I think the accountability definitely relies on that CISO, but then it's going to be kind of an interesting mix of characters that are actually performing the day-to-day operations. If you have the luxury of a security architect, certainly helping to orchestrate and figuring out what the process, like the actual workflow process looks like within these different phases, that's probably going to be the responsibility. But if your security team is anything like the security teams I've ever been a part of or led, titles don't really mean anything. So, I think it just comes down to, CISO is definitely responsible, and then figuring out how to inject yourself into these various value streams. It's going to be different for everybody. But again, this small baby steps, iterate through it. That's going to be the key to success.
Yeah. So let me pull on that a little bit. CISO owns this, let's say, and they have both the security and the business mindset to be able to translate between the two. How do you go about determining where do I start? Which value stream should I focus on first to start to offer value and start to build that credibility with the business? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good one. So I think, if you're going to look at the volume of existing material, requirements to deploy is definitely the first thing that comes to mind, right? Like lots of literature on what security should be doing within those phases. I think probably the place that I would start focusing on is on more of the request to fill and detect and correct phases, specifically around metrics, right? If you can't measure something, then you can't prove with certainty or with a quantitative reasoning that this is what is happening. You don't have anything to base your decisions that come down the line. So I think getting that data is of the utmost importance to start this process. And then I would start working backwards, because now I've got data that might have come from the request to fill phase or the detect and correct phase. I know now more than I did before, and it goes back to the iteration cycle. I can iterate through and figure out, well, I see these things happening. Like I see all of these cross-site scripting vulnerabilities coming from security researchers, or we're doing a lot of incidents that revolve around root cause of this type of vulnerability. Well, I can then walk backwards. Well, how would I prevent that happening from materializing up? And this goes back to the SDLC concepts of, well, I could do the requirements, I could maybe do some testing, and each one of those is going to have pros and cons. But that's where it comes to a security architect or someone who's got that experience to say, well, this would be the easiest place to inject it. And some teams, you might be in an IT shop where requirements don't mean a thing, and developers are just free to code. We're going to ship whatever we need. Maybe you just focus then purely on testing, because you can control that aspect. You can get a testing environment. You can start throwing some testing scripts at it, testing technologies. You can do that. That's easier than forcing the requirements. So it's a game of give and take and trying to figure out where can you inject yourself with the least amount of friction, and then you just keep iterating, growing the scope, growing the value that you are hopefully gaining through these value streams to continue to become a security organization that's providing value back.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You and I have had a separate conversation on, trying to look at aligning security with business, and we've explored trying to align with the business strategy on things like brand or things like reputation and things like compliance and those kinds of things. And it turns out that it can be difficult because the leap may be really large for some teams. And so what we try to do is we try to say, okay, let's look at it from a process standpoint. So we are executing these tasks. We know who is involved. We know what the process is. Out of this process naturally emerges certain metrics that would be valuable to the business, the artifacts that we produce, how quickly we can go about doing these, generating these artifacts, how real time they are. We hear a lot today about continuous security, and there's an angle in there from a process standpoint for teams that are just getting going on this to begin to consider what are the things that we can radiate out of these processes that we are doing right now anyway, and start to couch it in a way that at least starts to align with specific needs from a process standpoint that the business would find valuable. Any thoughts on that, Spencer?
Yeah, I think that's an important slant on the way that we do any of these cycles of work. Being able to extract that data is pretty important, and it's going to be challenging if you don't have the right technologies, if you don't have the right tools that already exist. But again, I think taking a practical lens and understanding that the volume of risk doesn't necessarily need to be fixed day one, because security is a long and involved process, and there's culture and there's history and tech debt that's all of those things are conspiring against us. But being able to start somewhere, and even if you try something and it doesn't work, that's still valuable because you gained the knowledge of this. I tried this thing, and this thing definitely did not work in this organization because of either people, process, or technology that just completely fell apart. Let's try something else, right? And you're learning from those past mistakes. So a lot of it is very much just like development will trial and error, you might give something a shot. You've got user surveys, you've got all these different things that exist within the product space. Same thing on the security side. There's no one silver bullet that exists. If it would, then most of us would be out of jobs. So we just have to iterate and keep working that people and process aspect of it to figure out what will actually work within our organizations.
Yeah, there's so much more that we can talk about that, even just within nuances of risk assessments, for example. How do we do that in a way that's really efficient and offers what the business is looking for, both in terms of procurement or acquisition or during the build cycle for custom software development? Like, there are many areas where security can definitely offer value back and align with what the business is looking for. So having said that, I invite folks, please do ask any questions you've got. And I'd like to turn it over to Raquel at this point. Raquel, if you want to moderate any questions or any thoughts at this point, you're welcome to do so as well.
Absolutely, thank you, Altaz and Spencer. That was great. Like Altaz mentioned, at this point, we would like to open it up to questions. So if you haven't had a chance to submit your question yet, please do so now through the Q&A chat. We did get a couple in already. So the first one is, how does the value stream discussion tie into lean thinking?
Spencer, you want to take that?
I want you to take that one first.
Sure. So we spoke a little bit about lean thinking, and what we have to do with security is we have to start, whenever we do lean thinking, we have to start with the end user of this information and work our way backwards. So it's not about thinking, how do we try and secure everything we've got all the time and start to take a look at NIST and ISO and start to push those down, but rather look at the stuff that the end, the business, for example, would be looking for, and see if there's a way that we can track back from there. And then the way the lean thinking comes in is, for every step, are there things we can do better? So there's a continuous improvement mindset that kicks into this as well. And what happens is, every stage that we look at in the pipeline to create the final artifact that goes out to the end business user, for example, or someone in the development team, we want to be able to go in there and elicit feedback from them. So there's that feedback mechanism that comes in. And just as we've got plan, do, check, that whole cycle that exists, we need to come in with that kind of a mindset and bring that into how we conduct security. And I know that it's a shift in mindset. We generally tend to think from our perspective, this is really important. This is what we think should be done. But we need to couch it in a broader context of the organization, where they're at. If it's a startup that needs to move to market quickly, we may not have the resources, the time, or the tools to do everything. So while we're producing this, much of that time that went into doing this is wasted, in the sense that we're not going to be able to enact on that at this point in time. So that's how I would suggest looking at security and lean and sort of integrating the two. Spencer?
Yeah, I think taking the lean thinking concept and applying that within the security sphere itself, that's really extremely valuable. And so if you want to take that lens of, well, how can I improve the things that security teams are doing, optimizing those processes, that's going to be pretty powerful from a business leader's perspective as well. It's like, well, the security team just isn't there just, closing tickets and doing things day in, day out that we don't know what it is. It's an iterative cycle. And I've said that several times on this webcast. The process of security is, if you want to think about the waste being tech debt or security vulnerabilities or bad things that are in the environment that we have to go and address, trying to reduce that down in the most optimum fashion, that's a very interesting way, a very business-centric way of thinking about what we do as our day-to-day jobs, and couching our discussions with other folks in that terminology and that mentality will definitely win some friends and hopefully win some resources to actually improve the things that we do day in, day out.
Yeah. Oh, you touched on a really interesting point, and I've found this out as well. If you are constantly fighting to defend the resources and the costs that are associated with security, couching it from a business value standpoint, oftentimes can lower that threshold so it's not so much of a battle to try to go and to acquire this stuff, the resources that are needed, because you're in fact proving that you're offering value back to the business, right? Raquel?
Perfect. So the next question we have here is, how can we map reports from security tools into business value?
Okay, Spencer?
Yeah, so make sure I understand the question. So mapping security reports back into business values. I think that's the art of turning these metrics, or the volume of data that we get, because we certainly deal with a lot of data day in, day out. Turning that into something that is actually tangible, that's the art. And I think that's why most of us still have jobs, is because we need someone who understands what is noise, what is the objective, what are the things that I care about from this volume of data that might be happening within your organization. So I think it's a bit tricky, but I would say, like you're still using the scientific method of, well, what do we think our hypothesis would be that this data is going to tell us, and trying to extract that out, either being proved right or wrong about what is that particular scenario. So if historically I know I'm always getting breached because of cross-site scripting, well, how can I find that within the data and pull that out to quantify? And now I've got a thing to stand on when I go and talk to development leads or IT directors. See, I've got this data. This data supports my hypothesis that we need to do something about cross-site scripting. Here are the options. What can we go and implement? So I don't know if there's a silver bullet again for this question, but I think that's the way that I would approach that, is to figure out what story am I trying to tell, and not, don't fudge the data, but use that data that might exist to turn that into things that support what you think the problem could be. And then that's helping you to drive, because you now have quantitative data. It's really hard to argue with quantitative data.
Yeah, I would also add to that, look at what that end business user is looking for. How are they rewarded? What is it that they need to execute on? And try to see from the tools that are available, what information do you think would be useful to extract and put it in a way that shows that individual, hey, look, here's something that will actually make your job easier, or it's something that's going to help you forecast a little bit better. And I would also suggest going to the individual and talking to them and saying, there's some information here. I was wondering if this might be of value to you. Approach it more with a set of questions with the intent of eliciting the kinds of things that might be valuable to them. So at least in that sense, you're starting to take a step forward towards the business world and trying to understand their perspective. And as this information starts to trickle, then from there, there's an opportunity to say, hey, here's some additional information as well. Can we look at other stuff? Can we now expand this a little bit further? And as Spencer mentioned, right, it's a gradual process. It's got a lot to do with building trust on the business side. It's got a lot to do with credibility. And these things take time. And it depends on the quality of the insights, of the information that's produced. But this is how we gradually start to build this out. Raquel?
Awesome. And this last question here, I believe, is a follow-up. The question is, what about compliance and regulations?
Yeah, so compliance and regulations are your friends, right? In a world where there are no compliance and regulatory input, then security is really, well, what do we think should be the best practice? And so, like, you've got CIS controls, you've got NIST, you've got other kind of things to stand upon when there aren't regulations that say, like, PCI DSS, like, these are the things that thou must do. That it just adds to that set of leverage that you have to be able to exact security within these value streams. I think what is interesting to note is that there are different drivers from a business perspective, right? So there's an idea of doing a cost to do business. So, COGS, cost of goods sold, is a cost to do business. Compliance and regulatory requirements is a cost to do business, right? Like, if you cannot, so I used to be at an energy company, if you cannot meet PUC requirements, then you're not going to sell energy. And that's probably going to put you out of business if you're an energy company. So that's kind of your minimum threshold. And those are definitely the things that you are focusing on first and you care about first. I think the trick here is to not be trapped into that's the only thing that you're going to do. So I really look at it as a complementary, or that's the backup that's behind me to say we need to do these security related concepts or inject security within these value streams. Compliance and regulatory requirements are just additional fodder for these are things that have to get done. And what I'm going to use if people are saying, well, I don't want to do this, I don't understand what the value prop is, we got to do that to do business. That's kind of how I've always kind of coached that discussion.
Yeah, I would agree. Especially in regulated environments, it's just the cost of doing business. I think, any breach of compliance in those cases can get pretty expensive. And so I think, it becomes a little bit more difficult when you're in a non-regulated environment. How do you go about, discussing compliance? And what I would suggest in those contexts is think about it more in terms of a set of minimum practices that we should be engaged in. Right? Standards and frameworks are not intended to be the ultimate level of security. It's really, about across a broad spectrum of companies in terms of sizes and industries. This is what that standard or that framework has come out with to suggest that at least we should be doing this. And looking at that, and I think picking out the low-hanging fruit is probably a good starting point. Make it easy to understand. You may be doing compliance, in the sense of complying with a given framework or a standard to set the minimum bar of what you think security needs to be. It can be a hard sell. So if you can couch it again in terms of business value and how adhering to a framework can help you, can maybe make things easier. Maybe there's a merger happening at some point, or these kinds of business types of discussions can kind of help to couch and build a case for why something like this should be happening. There's much more we can certainly talk about. How do you get security into a non-regulated environment and things like that? And perhaps we'll do that in a future webcast. Raquel, over to you.
Well, that was the last question that we had come in. So thank you so much again, Altaz and Spencer. It was a great session. Just to let everybody know, we do have webinars lined up for the next few weeks. So if you're interested in attending any of these, please go to the upcoming events and webinar section of our website to sign up. We hope everyone found this presentation insightful. And again, we will provide a link to the recording of this webinar to everyone here via email. Thank you again for attending. Stay well and safe and have a great day.